The Shoreline Symposium started in 2019 as an in-person event between the BCK CISMA, headed by Fallon, and the Southwest by Southwest Corner CISMA. CISMAs are these collaborative organizations that work together to help stop the spread of invasive species, and we cover every county in the state of Michigan as a resource to our residents. This event was originally in person, but we're really excited to be able to work with the Stewardship Network to bring it into this virtual space to still help lake and riparian owners learn more about their lakes and what we can do to help protect them. Being in this virtual space, I want to just go quickly over some of our expectations. If you could use the Q&A feature at the bottom for any questions, that would be great so that we have them in one space and can make sure that we get to all of them. Well, you can go ahead and introduce yourself and your lake in the chat feature. This event will also be recorded and available on the Stewardship Network's YouTube page, so feel free to share this out far and wide so that other people can get information. Additionally, you are also registered for the remainder of the events in this series, which will go on every Monday at 1 p.m. for the remainder of February. But please feel free to share that registration link with all of your other fellow friends and lake members so that we can help spread this information. With no further ado, I would like to introduce Erick. He is a limnologist and water resource educator with Michigan State University Extension. His main responsibilities are to promote and research the wise use, protection, and restoration of our freshwater systems. And I have taken some of his plant identification courses before, and it always blows my mind how much I learn every single time. So I am also very, very excited for today's presentation. Thank you guys very much and enjoy the program.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to get my screen up here. Just for confirmation, are you seeing my identification of aquatic plants?
Yep, looks great.
Perfect, thank you. Well, thank you for that introduction. My name is Erick Elgin, like you heard, and I've been working with aquatic plants and natural shorelines for a long time. I'm the vice chair of the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, and I'm also the lead for the Citizen Science Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. So you can see those logos down below here, Michigan Clean Water Corps and Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. And in those roles, you know, I work a lot with protection of our shorelines, and that's why I'm so happy that this series is happening, because it's focusing on, you know, what can people do on the shoreline to improve their water and to understand their lakes a little bit more. And so today I'm going to cover a little bit a specific on that, and that's aquatic plants. A lot of the talk is going to be on kind of a broad overview of kind of some highlights of aquatic plants that are common in Michigan, but I'll also cover a bit about why they're important and what they do for our lakes. So our first interactions with aquatic plants, you know, as people, usually have come from, here in Michigan at least, jumping in a lake and having them touch our feet. And, you know, as you know, I want you to picture back as a kid, and you may have initially viewed as like, you plants, you know, or you wouldn't say plants, you'd say weeds, you weeds. And but then once you put that snorkel mask on, once you start tooling around, you start to become attracted to those plants, you know, because what's in those plants? That's where the cool fish, that's where the cool invertebrates, that's where you're chasing turtles. And so you find yourself going from ew plants to, wow, these are really neat, and you're in them. Now things change through time, and as we grow up, that sentiment I see comes back. And so we see across the upper Midwest, where we have lots of lakes, the loss of vegetation. We have the loss of vegetation on the shoreline proper. You know, we have a lot less trees than you naturally would, shrubs, grasses, flowers. But even when we start to peer inside the water, we have lost a lot of our aquatic plants, from the emergent bulrushes and burr reeds to the floating leaf plants like yellow water lily, white water lily, and then to the pondweeds that we find under the water. And it's because of that sentiment of ew plants, where we don't want them in our in front of our water bodies for various reasons. But hopefully today, after today, you get a more of a sense that these are important, plants play an important role in our water bodies, and they're really cool in themselves. So aquatic plants, it's a super diverse community down there. I typically consider it an underwater forest. We have multiple, we have the top canopy, we have some pondweeds that can grow 10 feet tall and create a nice canopy like a tree. And then we have low growing species like musk grass below. And you have everything in between. So you can have a lot of diversity under there. Some quick plant facts to kind of point that out is pondweed is a common name used out there for aquatic plants, but that's, when you say pondweed, it actually is referring to a specific genus of aquatic plants called the potamogetans. And there's 28 species of them. So 28 species of potamogetans, of pondweeds in Michigan alone. And milfoil, that's a name thrown out there a lot too. So milfoil is referring to the genus Myriophyllum. When we hear that, a lot of times it's a cringe. It's like, oh, milfoil's bad. But actually, there are 6 native milfoils, and only 2 of them are invasive. So we have 8 in all, only 2 of them are invasive. And one is more widespread, as many of you probably know, with Eurasian milfoil. But the other one is not well established. It's not established in Michigan, actually. And then just to show kind of the neat diversity out there, there are 10 submersed carnivorous species. So there are bladderworts out there that have these sacs like this, and they have a trigger hair. And when they get triggered by a little critter floating in the water, it opens and closes in like some 900th of a second or some tiny number. And it then dissolves and eats the juice of the zooplankton and other plankton inside of it. But it's not just the diversity that's really neat. They also do a tremendous amount. So here's a graph that shows a shoreline in the water that has no aquatic plants, and then on the right-hand side having aquatic plants. And so when we get waves, so waves we typically just see on the surface, but actually there's energy that goes down into the water column. And so that wave energy, as it drags across the bottom, suspends sediment. And those sediments reduce water clarity because there's now little particles in the water, but then also those particles often hold excess phosphorus that they release into the water, and then which can contribute to algal problems. Now, when we have aquatic plants there, they act like a carpet. They are holding that sediment in place, and also that energy is absorbed within the stems of the aquatic plants. So you get low amounts of sediment resuspension, and actually you get sediment deposition. And that actually creates clear water, like localized clear water within the plant bed. And they're amazing habitat. I think all fish species need aquatic plants in Michigan at some point in their life. So it's either when they're first born, when they're spawning, when they're eating, when they're hiding from being eaten. Aquatic plants are wonderful habitat, but it's not just for fish, it's for a variety of critters, from snails that are eating algae that grows on the surface of the plants, to a whole lot of other little organisms. And of course, plants produce oxygen with photosynthesis, and that's really important in these warm areas where plants grow in the littoral zone, the shallow zone of a lake. And so it's a really important component of oxygen production in the heat of the summer. And nutrient cycling is important. So aquatic plants need sunlight, but algae can get in the way of that. So they're actually in competition with algae. And so aquatic plants can sequester the nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen within their tissue, and then also produce allelopathic chemicals and all these sorts of things, so it keeps the water clear above it. And that goes especially for our shallow lakes. When there is an abundance of aquatic plants in a lake that's shallow, which is normal, you actually get really clear water. But if you lose those aquatic plants for whatever reason, you actually have the lake flip over into an algal dominated state. And not to be diminished, they are beautiful. It's amazing when you're in some of these lakes and seeing the diversity. It's beautiful. And then one more importance that there's some studies showing this is on a localized scale. If you have a healthy aquatic plant community, native aquatic plant community in let's say in front of your house, it actually resists invasion. So it might be harder for Eurasian milfoil, let's say, to come into the lake and take, or into that spot and take off. And just a note, I'm not focusing on invasive plants. There's actually not a lot of established aquatic invasive plants in Michigan. The three that I have here, Eurasian water milfoil, curly-leaf pondweed, and Stary Stonewort, those are the three established submersed aquatic plants in Michigan. And that's it. We don't have any others. So our outreach about aquatic invasive species, AIS, has been really good. We have shown like, hey, you know, stop the movements, prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. And people have noticed, you know, so there's an awareness that comes with that. And the only problem with that is a lot of times when people see an abundance of native aquatic plants, the first trigger is that it's invasive. But when you look at just the numbers, there's way more diversity of native plants than there are invasive. So I'll still cover how to identify these three species in my next part of my conversation, but it'll be with some of the natives. And I just want to throw in a plug for, if you are really interested in aquatic plant monitoring and training, the Michigan Clean Water Corps' Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program has a number of parameters where you can, it's a citizen science program where you can collect aquatic plant data, either doing early detection for aquatic invasive plants or for the entire plant community. So let's go into some identification. When we talk about aquatic plants, the term is actually quite broad, but this presentation where I'm going is going to be very specific. So I guess first though, lakes are broken up into different zones. And when thinking about aquatic plants, what we say is littoral zone and limnetic zone. These are zones based off of light and depth. So the littoral zone is the area of a lake where light can penetrate down to the sediments, which can allow aquatic plants to grow. So that's the littoral zone. And when we look at the littoral zone, we can have emergent plants, free floating plants like duckweeds, rooted floating plants like yellow water lily, and submersed plant like those pondweeds or milfoils like I mentioned. And I'm going to be focusing on specifically the free floating, rooted floating, and submersed. Otherwise, when we start getting into the emergent, those are getting into more wetland species, and now you have 400 plus species of sedges, for example. So we're going to be focusing on this for today's talk. So now I'm just going to walk you through those different groups, covering some of the more common species and some things to look out for. So free floating species, I added this in here because I get calls every once in a while about an algal bloom on a pond or an algal bloom on a lake, when in fact it's not an algal bloom at all. It's one of our free floating species. And as you can see here, so this is just a picture of a very small area of a pond, and there are actually 3 species I can see here. Here's one, and then here's one. I think that's all. There might be a 4th. So you can see just in this little bit that there's a lot. And here's my kind of field ID tips for you. So is it smaller if you pick it up in your hand, is it smaller than my hand, and does it have roots? Those are the things that you ask yourself. So free floating plants in Michigan that are bigger than your hand or fills your entire hand like one plant does, it likely is going to indicate that it's an invasive species. And I want to mention these are somewhat rare. There's one species that's becoming a little bit more common, but still very rare. And then let's say it's smaller than your hand, knowing if there are roots and how many will help distinguish among the native species. So let's kind of go through that. And by the way, so what we see here is the little, there's one species, here's 2 species, and there's 3 species right there. So here's kind of the ID help. So is it smaller than your hand? In this case, yes, it's like the fingertip. If you look to see the roots, if there's 1 root per leaf, you're now looking at the duckweeds. So that's the genus Lemna. So there's let's see, there's 4 species. I think there's 4 species of Lemna. This is one of the more common ones. This is Lemna trisulca, and just the one root coming down from one of these leaves. Now, if you flipped it over and you saw many roots coming down, now you're looking at large duckweed. Now, note the use of common names here. So large duckweed is a common name, but it's not what we would consider a true duckweed, which is Lemna. So large duckweed is Spirodella polyhoriza. But really all you need to know is large duckweed, lots of roots coming down. Also, there's this purple underside. What if there are no roots? And that's what this is. So this is very tiny. This is watermeal, or Wolfia is the genus. And this is where if you picked it up out of the water, it would feel like cornmeal in between your fingers. So it's very small. It's the world's tiniest flowering plant. It has no root and it feels like cornmeal. So pretty easy to ID to watermeal. Now going to the bigger one. So this is where if you picked it up in your hand, the plant itself is the size of your hand or bigger. And excuse me. And this is a species that the state of Michigan and others are really concerned about and are actively pursuing management and outreach and control. So European Frogbit. We had this European Frogbit's been in Michigan on the coastlines of Lake Huron and Erie for quite some time. But just recently, actually 2016 was the first time we saw it kind of leap into Grand Rapids. And then since then, we've had a few more inland water bodies invaded by European Frogbit. So how can you tell what this is? So it's bigger than your hand. It's totally free floating unless it's in really shallow water. And so the roots hang below. The leaves are small and heart-shaped, only just a bit bigger than a quarter, and small white flowers with 3 petals. And here's a good picture kind of to show where you find it and kind of in comparison, what does it look like? So this is how small the leaves are compared to the more common white water lily. And as you can see, white water lily can actually have some pretty big leaves and small leaves. The big difference here is those white water lilies are rooted to the bottom. So if you pull it, you're going to get resistance, where these you'll pull right out of the water. Also just thinking about where you find them, the habitat you find them. Since they're free floating, they get jammed into the cattails or in other slow moving kind of collection areas, a lot of times in the emergent species, and that's where they collect. So moving into rooted floating. So there's not a ton of species that fall into this category. Our most common ones are the water lilies, and there are a few species of them. Some of them are uncommon, but there are 3 of them that are very common. Water shield is pretty common, and there's a few pondweeds that put up floating leaves, and I'll cover those as well, and water smartweed. If you're in Southeast Michigan, you get the pleasure of having a threatened species with water lotus, which I didn't show here mainly because it's not in too many locations. So the difference between yellow and white. So obviously you'd say, Eric, the flower is yellow and the flower is white. There, you know the difference. Well, there's a little bit, what if there's no flower? So oftentimes we don't have flowers for many of our aquatic plants when we're out there surveying. So we need something a little bit more. And so that's where you start to look at the leaves. So as you can see, the shape of this leaf is much more oblong than here. So this is quite circular. And then also you have really sharp sinuses. So this is sharp and this is sharp, where this is much more rounded and then oblong. So when you have an oblong, much more rounded lobes, you have a yellow water lily. And when it looks more like Pac-Man, you have a white water lily. Now, there's 2 common yellow water lilies, and this is how you can tell. So how you can tell is you look at the petiole, and the petiole is called the leaf stalk. So here's a picture of the leaf stalk. What I did was snipped the end of it, and look how it looks like a why it's called bull lily is it looks like a bull. There's the horns, there's the big forehead, and here's the head. So when you snip it and see that, you're looking at bull lily, Nuphar variegata. And the other one is Nuphar advena, and that one is more circular. And this one also props itself out of the water a lot more. So you might see this actually emerging out of the water. But this is the easiest way. Just take a scissors and snip it and take a peek. And of course, I get calls about this every once in a while too. So you know, like it's a joke to say a dead octopus, but I've had calls about that there might be a dead octopus in my lake, and so this is fairly common. The people on this webinar may have seen something like this before. So these are the rhizomes of the bull lily, the yellow lily. What happens is that these are underground stems, so lots of different leaves and petioles come off from these scars here, but when winter breaks up and there's a lot of wind and disturbance, these can break loose out of the sediment and funnel around the lake. And as they rot, they smell really bad, and but are very interesting. This is another common site. You know, really pretty. The colors that come with some of our aquatic plants are really nice and elegant. So this is water shield. So this is the plant that we just saw in the previous photo, and these are different than the water lilies for a few reasons. One of the big things is you don't see a notch, right? There's no cut into the center. Also, the petiole, that's what this is. Remember that leaf stalk comes into the center of the leaf that so happens to look like a shield, or you can say a football. Now, what's funny about common names is that there could be a bunch of common names for that particular species. So the most common one is water shield, but it's also called snot bonnet, which is just a ridiculous name, but hopefully maybe something to help you remember. So why would a common name be called snot bonnet? If you look closely at this picture, you see like there's like a gelatin on the underside, the shininess, and then also along that petiole. So there is this mucous membrane that is on the underside and all over the underwater part of the plant. I had a friend who would put it on their sunburn and said it made it feel better. I'm not advocating for that. Never seen any evidence that works, and I wouldn't want anyone to have an allergic reaction. But she thought it was perfect for sunburns. Another common one that we see, especially, so we've been having high water in the state, as many of you probably know, and this plant is kind of a marginal plant. It definitely can be in the lake proper, but it's usually close to the edge of the shoreline. And this is water smartweed, a beautiful yellow, pink flower that emerges up out of the water, and these nice kind of floating leaves that are pretty thick. And if you looked closely, if you held it, where the leaves come into the stem, they would be swollen nodes, is what we call it. So a node is where a leaf is coming in, and there's nice and swollen. If your water level goes down, this plant doesn't go away. It actually will just live in a different form. It just won't have floating leaves. Okay, moving into the submersed species. There's a whole lot of them, and for a 45-minute presentation, it's pretty tough to cover them in enough detail that will help kind of get all of them in mind. So I picked a few highlights, and I'll cover some of the details. And as I'm telling you about some of the ID characteristics of the plants, that'll help with understanding how to apply that knowledge to other species as well. So I've organized the submersed species by the leaf type and arrangement. So what I mean by leaf type is that we have kind of two broad leaf types. And you can think of these as the leaf types that you see out on trees. So an oak leaf is considered a simple leaf. That's the same as a maple leaf. That's a simple leaf. One leaf structure is coming out of a node. When you think of walnut trees or ash trees, there are multiple, the leaves are much more complex. We call those compound leaves. And those compound leaves are made up of leaflets. So in the in the aquatic world, we call them entire leaves or finely divided leaves. And I'll show you examples of those soon. And now within the entire leaves, I broke them up into the leaf arrangement. So leaf arrangement is kind of referring to where the leaves come out of the stem in relation to one another. So I think hopefully you can see me on this. I can't see myself, but if this is the stem right here and the leaves are coming off like this is opposite leaf arrangement. If they're off of each other like that and a leaf goes out here and a leaf comes out here, that is considered alternate leaf arrangement. And then I'll show you, for example, what whorled and basal looks like. And actually, this is a great picture here. This is Vallisneria americana, water celery, and all the leaves are coming from one spot, and that would be considered basal. If you're familiar with aquatic plant or with plant ID, it's also considered rosette, basal rosette. So looking at Alodia, or looking at entire leaves that are whorled, this is a very common plant. When we say Alodia or Canada waterweed, we're kind of referring typically to one of two species that are fairly common. The most common one that we run into is the Alodia canadensis, Canada waterweed. And so what we look at here, so here's the leaf, or here's the stem. Here's a cross section where you cut on both sides. And what you can see here is 3 leaves coming out of one plane. And so this is whorled with 3 leaves coming out. The other species of Alodia is Alodia natalii, and you can see there's still 3 leaves, but one's a lot more skinny. So this top one's a lot more skinny than this one. It does flower, but out of like the 15 years of surveying aquatic plants, I've seen this flower once. And I was really happy to see it. It was pretty cool. So that's why we really look at the vegetative characteristics. I didn't show it here, but there is a plant that we consider like the devil plant, the worst aquatic invasive plant that could come into Michigan. It currently is not here, but that's called hydrilla. So I'll just say, if you ever find a plant that looks like Alodia, but there are 5 or more leaves coming out of one whorl, and those leaves have big teeth or serrations, feel free to give me a call or contact EGLE, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, because we would want to know. Another group of plants that is whorled and simple leaves is Kera, or Kera, the family Keraceae, which is known as the stoneworts. I chose this because they are a really important group of plants out there. These plants are typically low growing and create a carpet, and they also compete with algae really well for nutrients, and also they release chemicals into the water called alleopathic chemicals that deter algal growth. And so they're super important for the lake itself, but then also for the ecosystem services that we like out of lakes as well, like clear water. Anyways, it's not a plant at all. It's actually a macroalgae. And what we mean by macroalgae is that it's a algae that is huge and that we can see with our naked eye. We can see the cells. When you have simple leaves, and what I mean by that is just one leaf coming out of the stem, it is going to be Kera. And then when it's divided, it's Nutella. I won't go into details with that. But there we go. One thing I want to mention, if you've ever been fishing or swimming or wherever where you've disturbed some of these plants, you'd lift it up and it has a really distinct smell. The common name for Kera is musk grass. And what I describe it as, it smells like lake, like it is like lake sediment. I feel like it reminds me of summer, but some people think it's like rotten eggs. And just to note, so although this is a really important group of plants, there is one prominent invasive, and that's called Stary Stonewort, or Nyctalopsis obtusa. It's pretty hard to identify when you don't have experience with the plant, but one way you can tell no matter what is if you pull up a plant that kind of looks like this. By the way, this is native Kera, but if you pull up a plant and it has this structure, so it has these kind of fishing line like structures, and on those structures you see the star shaped white thing, and you can see the size because this is, so it's fairly small. But if you see that, you're likely, or you are holding on to Stary Stonewort, which hopefully, if it's an early detection management, there is some management success, but it also can take over your lake fairly quickly as well. So moving on to entire leaves that are basal or ribbon-like. So here's a very common one called water celery. So the leaves are all coming down into one spot right at the sediment and water interface and all coming up. These swirls, which you have maybe seen, that's actually what's holding up the flower. So these are the flower stalks, and at the very tip of it will be the flower. And so it gets pollinated above the water, and once it does, it gets pulled back down so it can release its seeds. Now there's a few basal ribbon-like plants out there, different species, but you can tell by, if you took a segment of this leaf and held it up to the sky, you can see through it. So that's what this picture is showing. And what I always describe this as, it looks like a highway. You have your center strip, you have where you drive, you have the cracks in the road, and then you have your shoulder. If you see this kind of venation, the veins inside the leaf, you're holding on to water celery. If you see something more that looks like bricks being laid down, that is burrweed, for example. So the pondweeds, a really important group of plants in Michigan just due to their diversity and the breadth of what kind of lake and water body that they are found in. So the quick field ID, so you pull up plants from a lake, how do you know you're holding on to a pondweed or something else? And so what it is if you pull it up and you see a simple leaf, so that's just one kind of leaf like this, you have alternate leaf arrangement, so a plant coming off there, and here's the stem, and you see a mid vein, you are for the most part probably holding on to a pondweed. Now to help kind of show you what the different forms of pondweeds are out there, or different species, I put them into broad categories. So we have our narrow leaf pondweeds, broad leaf pondweeds with a leaf stalk, or broadleaf that are clasping. And I'll tell you what all these mean. And then there are some that are just floating. So the narrowleaf first. So narrowleaf pondweeds, there's a handful of species that can be quite difficult to identify. Oftentimes you need magnification and you're looking at things like, what does the seed look like? So this is the seed for pondweeds, and this is the flower. And then also you're looking for things like nodal glands. So if you're really getting into aquatic plant identification, I'd be happy to talk with you more in detail about this, but here's the stem, here's the leaf, and these pimple-like structures are really important because that distinguishes one group of narrowleaf pondweeds from another. But really what it looks like is when you pull it up out of the water, it'll be like a tangled mat of grass is what it'll look like. So, and just to mention that there are some threatened species of narrowleaf pondweeds in Michigan. A more common narrowleaf pondweed that is, actually it's very common, is Sago Pondweed. So you may have seen something like this where a plant is matting at the surface with very thin leaves. And here's a picture of a single plant coming up. So this is the flowers, or these are the flowers. And these are the leaves that are heavily branched. These plants are really important for migratory birds. Those seeds are packed full of carbohydrates, perfect for birds flying, thousands of miles and using our lakes as stopovers in that migration. Okay, moving on to broadleaf. So these become a little bit easier to ID, and here's a good example of that. So here are two species that are fairly common: Illinois pondweed on the left, and on the right, longleaf pondweed. When you first glance at it, it doesn't look that different. The leaves are fairly similar in size. Maybe these are a bit bigger, but fairly similar. But then look at one thing. And so this is the stem, and this right here, this long thing, that's the petiole, or that leaf stalk. Much longer on longleaf pondweed than Illinois pondweed. So just that simple characteristic, you can divide these two plants up where you can see that this petiole for this Illinois pondweed is much smaller, much smaller. But how about another one? Another other group of broadleaf pondweeds would be clasping. So there's, what I mean by clasping is like is hugging, and you look at it as like the degree of hugging to some regard. So in this plant, there's no petiole. In fact, it is hugging, but it's like a polite hug you would give somebody you don't know very well. Whereas clasping leaf pondweed is hugging around the stem. That leaf is hugging the stem like you're good friends. And there is one more uncommon one where it's like a big bear hug where you're actually overlapping your arms together. And so how can you tell the difference other than that degree of hugging? Because that's kind of hard, and if you don't have a lot of experience with these two plants, it'd be very difficult. Well, what you do is once you notice that a plant is clasping the stem or hugging the stem, you then look at the leaf tip. So you'd go towards the tip of the leaf. And if you squeeze the tip of the leaf and it cracks it open, you're looking at white stem pondweed. If you squeeze the tip of the leaf and no opening occurs, you're looking at clasping leaf pondweed. So again, although the plants look fairly similar, it's pretty simple characteristics to separate them from one another. So let's talk about an invasive species. So curlyleaf pondweed, the only invasive pondweed out of all 28 species. So what's nice is that it's pretty simple to identify. So if we have our simple leaves, we have an obvious midvein, they're alternate on the leaf on the stem, and then all you have to say is the leaf serrated, or does the leaf have teeth up and down the edge? And so you'd look at the edge here and you'd see all these teeth, and now you know that it's curlyleaf pondweed. No other pondweed has serrations up and down the leaf edge. And finally, the floating leaf pondweed. So many pondweeds actually create a floating leaf, but so I could have put them in the floating leaf category. However, some of them are actually combined. They have a floating leaf, leaf that floats, and an underwater leaf. Actually, all of them do. And so I wanted to put it here just to be more clear. One of the most common ones is floating leaf pondweed, Ponmegeton natans. And what's nice here is if you see a pondweed that's floating, you can look at the end of where the petiole attaches to the leaf. If it's kind of this lighter colored and pretty much 90-degree bend, you're looking at Ponmegeton natans. So that's nice. Nice and simple. So you can see it here too. Just this light colored and then 90-degree bend. Okay, moving on to finely divided. So now we're moving away from those simple leaves to the compound leaves, the finely divided. And of course, there's a few different groups of finely divided plants. The ones that kind of look like feathers or Christmas trees. There's some that we would say forked or looks like a wishbone. And there are some that are heavily branched. And this one just so happens to be heavily branched with bladders. So that makes it easy with bladderwort. So probably the most common one that we run into and are concerned about as riparians and lake managers are the milfoils. And really because it comes down to, we have Eurasian water milfoil. I put them in scientific names because some of them don't really have much of a common name. So Myriophyllum spicatum is Eurasian water milfoil, and Myriophyllum aquaticum is parrot feather. This one is very uncommon, and in fact, there's a team in Eagle and the DNR that work to, when it is detected, they do a rapid response, or they respond. So what do I mean by finely divided? And then also, what are some of these ID tips that'll help? So this is one leaf. So you can see that with this. So this is considered one leaf. And when we say leaflet, we're looking at just one of these structures coming off. So there are many leaflets on this leaf. This is important because that's one of our most important characteristics for identification. How many leaves or how many leaflets are on a leaf? Also, leaf arrangement is important. So right in this picture, this is whorled, but in some it's actually scattered. So you might have a leaf coming out here, a leaf coming out here, a leaf coming out here. Stem color is also important. Is it pink? Is it brown? Is it green? Is it white? And then if there's flowers present, there might be some descriptions there as well that can help. So these are important because if you do encounter a milfoil-like plant but you want to confirm identification, whoever you contact are going to ask you a few common things. Or if you're taking a picture, making sure that you can show the leaf arrangement, and showing off the leaves and the leaflets is really helpful for identification. So here, for example, is one of our native milfoils, northern water milfoil. And see, so here's the plant itself, and then here's just one of the leaves broken off. And so this is where we would ask, well, what's the leaf arrangement is whorled. All the leaves are coming off of one distinct part of the stem. And then we would count the sides of how many leaflets are on here and just count one side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's pretty much 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So if you have a milfoil with less than 12 leaflet pairs per leaf, and you have a white-ish stem, you are looking at northern water milfoil. But how about Eurasian milfoil? How do you compare with that one? So Eurasian milfoil is that feather-like leaves, but the leaves have 12 or more pairs of leaflets compared to the northern water milfoil. The leaves are still whorled, and instead of being white, the stems are typically pinkish or light pinkish. And when you pull it out of the water, so northern water milfoil, when you pull it out of the water, stays robust. The leaves stay open, whereas when you pull Eurasian milfoil out, it collapses within your hand. I won't get into it too much, but unfortunately, Eurasian milfoil readily hybridizes with northern milfoil, so it makes identification extremely difficult. In fact, you can't identify a hybrid without a genetic test. So what about some other ones, some other finely divided leaves out there? So this is a really common plant found in most water bodies in southern Michigan, called coontail. This is a free floating, it can be on the bottom, but you can find it all over the water column. And as you can see, it no longer has that feather-like leaf of the milfoils. In fact, it looks like a wishbone or a peace sign with your fingers, that is. And so if you see that, you're looking at a coontail. There's a couple species of that, but this one is the most common, Stratophyllum demersum, common coontail. So let's look at a couple more examples of finely divided leaves. The bladderworts. I think I promised to say something about carnivorous species. Here are our carnivorous species. So the bladderworts are amazing. I remember when I first saw a flower as a kid, I thought there were orchids blooming out of the water where I lived, but it was bladderworts instead. So very beautiful flower, fairly small, the size of kind of your pinky nail. And what you see here is this is one leaf, and then it's heavily branched. So it's still finely divided, but it doesn't quite look like a milfoil where it's simple leaflets coming off. Instead, it's highly branched. And what's nice is these bladderworts have bladders. And so that really gives away to identifying it to utricularia or bladderwort. And there's a few different species of bladderwort, from ones that are purple flowers and whorled around the leaf edge to ones that are really tiny where the flowers are the size of like a pencil head. And this is our most common bladderwort, which is called common bladderwort in Michigan. Pretty neat. I would recommend taking a look at it. And because this presentation is for Southwest Michigan, a plant that I've run into now multiple times in different surveys is fanwort or Kabamba caroliniana. As you can see, this is a highly branched, finely divided leaf. This is one leaf, and how you can parse this out from the other species is that so it's highly branched. it has a petiole and they're opposite from one another. So again, it's branched, opposite, with petioles. If you see that in your lake, you are going to be having fanwort, which is an invasive species. There's not many occurrences of it in Michigan, but in some lakes in Southwest Michigan is very heavy, and also in some river systems. So that was kind of a blitz through some common plants here in Michigan, as well as some of their characteristics that we look for when identifying aquatic plants. But there's a whole lot more to gain when looking at aquatic plants. And so if you're interested in learning more, here are 3 books I recommend. It's kind of at the level of what you want. If you're interested just having something to help out with common plants and learning initially, Through the Looking Glass is great. I still reference it as well. It has great line drawings and great descriptions. The next one I would go for is The Aquatic Plants of the Upper Midwest. This book is really comprehensive and has most of the plants that we would have here in Michigan, and great photographs and great descriptions. And if you're looking for a little bit more, there's a dichotomous key in the back. So a dichotomous key is a yes/no tree. So you just go through trying to identify what plant it is by saying yes or no to characteristics. And if you're really getting into it, Aquatic and Wetland Plants of Northeastern North America by Garrett Crow and Hellquist. This is a 2-volume behemoth that has everything that you would need, but all dichotomous keys with some line drawings. And then just a little bit about lake stewardship when thinking about aquatic plants is that, there's the typical ew plants factor, or ew weeds, but this causes issues. It reduces habitat, it can increase erosion, it can decrease water quality and clarity. So I'd encourage to kind of look at the riparian area in the near shore zone, in the littoral zone, where of course you need to have a place where you want to get in and out of your dock and enjoy the water, maybe with having less plants there. But if you're not using all of the shoreline for that, it's important to keep as much of the aquatic plant community intact as possible. And then I would say the best part of, the thing with lake stewardship is that enjoy them. If you enjoy them and know of them, it's easier to protect. And also, if you love fishing, aquatic plants are a necessity. And, going back to that underwater forest, and there is kind of aquatic plants are easily lost. There's been a few studies out there to show that in lakes that are heavily developed, that aquatic plant diversity is much lower, and in some cases are almost there's almost no aquatic plants present. And so it's important that we know of them, and they're pretty neat in themselves. So thank you very much. If you're interested in doing, if you're interested in contacting me, feel free to. That's my cell number as well as my email. And then also, if you are interested in monitoring aquatic plants, invasive or native plants in your lake or in an area lake that you love going to, you can visit mycore.net, and that brings you to our citizen science program, the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. Registration hasn't opened yet for this upcoming season, but will be opening in the next few weeks. But you can go to that website, learn a little bit more, and sign up for a listserv to be notified when we're available. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to, so feel free to put some questions in. I'm going to look at them and start to answer. And again, it's ask away. And by the way, thank you very much. That I know that's a lot of stuff to cover, but I hope you were able to get a little bit. So Michelle asks, I would love to be able to print these slides. Will this be available to us later to print? So I can, yes, I can provide these slides to Nor, and maybe this can be put somewhere. Does that sound possible, Nor?
Yeah, absolutely. We can find a resource for that, and we will post it on the Facebook event page for this. where
Perfect.
those can be found.
And I'd be happy, you can contact me directly and I can get some of these slides for you. Oop, I think I maybe, okay, well, question. Was told curlyleaf pondweed is fairly seasonal, usually gone by mid-July. Is it worth the cost to chemically treat curlyleaf pondweed so people can enjoy the lake's recreation in May, June, and July? Yeah, so curlyleaf pondweed is seasonal. It can actually start growing underneath the ice. So you can have a large amount of biomass in the springtime and early summer, and then in some situations it comes back into the fall, late summer, fall months as well. You can get a peak biomass. So yes, curlyleaf pondweed is a little complicated, and as a lake or individual, you have to make your own determination. So in some situations, curlyleaf pondweed can take over and can inhibit the growth of other native species, other native aquatic plants, as well as disrupt a whole bunch of other things. So if you're in a lake that is covered in it, the recommendation is usually to treat. Now, curlyleaf pondweed also, you can have just a few plants here and there, and it's almost like it's just a member of the native aquatic plant community. In that case, if you don't want to chemically treat it, you don't have to. And in fact, what you can do is just, the management recommendation would be to monitor it. So if it's really not a big deal and not taking over and causing any negative issues on your lake, then just monitor it year after year. And if it does explode, you can treat it. But if not, it just is part of the one of the members of the community. If aquatic vegetation is killed off with chemicals in order to increase recreation use of the lake, how can this vegetation be removed or dissolved in order to prevent their buildup in the muck? Okay, so let me read this again. If aquatic vegetation is killed off with chemicals in order for increase of vegetation, recreation, how can this vegetation be removed? Yeah, so there are some, when you create dying biomass within a lake, it is decomposed by bacteria and fungus, and those bacteria and fungus are utilizing oxygen. And so that's one of the consequences of creating a whole lot of dead matter in your lake. And this can slowly build up through time in different parts of a lake. Now that's also a natural occurrence that there's muck in lakes. So how can it be removed or dissolved in order to prevent their buildup? That's a complicated question because there are different ways you can remove. So in some circumstances, you can harvest plants instead of chemically treating. So if it's due to recreation, you can use aquatic plant harvesting that can create lanes, for example, from your dock out to the deeper parts of the water so you can get your boat in and out. So that's for recreation. Instead of using herbicide, you can use an aquatic plant harvester for that. Now there's consequences to an aquatic plant harvester as well. But if you have, since that's kind of a big question, I'd be happy to talk to you on the side to answer that. Will the program be available? We missed first half because time was given at 2. Yeah, they are, William, they are recording this. So the recording will be available, I think, soon. And Nora will make sure that, I'm assuming participants will get that link. Is aquatic plant competition affected by nutrient loading? Yes, so certain plants can handle certain conditions better than others. So this is just one example. So Stukinia, Sago Pondweed. Sago Pondweed can handle more eutrophic conditions, and eutrophic conditions mean more algal dominated systems, because when it starts to grow, it grows up and then starts to create a canopy. And so it can still reach the sun. So now it's competing with the sun with algae, but then also if it's creating a canopy up above, it's creating shade below, which is now competition. So in that system where there's lots of nutrients, Sago Pondweed will have a competitive advantage to other aquatic plants within that community. Sorry if that's kind of a complicated answer, but let me know if you need any clarification. So I see the Q&A, but I saw maybe some questions come up in chat.
Yeah, so I had one question that I found in chat from Nancy. Does curly-leaved pondweed spread by cuttings?
Yeah, so yep, so a lot of, that's something I didn't cover, and I'll make it broad. Many aquatic plants can reproduce vegetatively, and what that means is it doesn't need to have a flower and a seed. Instead, it needs just a fragment, and if that fragment gets cut, if a plant gets cut up, gets blown around, and then goes back into the sediment, it can grow a whole new colony. So that's many aquatic plants, not all.
Fantastic. With that, I think we are almost at our time. I want to thank you again for taking your time to come and speak with us today as the first participant in our Shoreline Symposium. Again, this recording will be available on the Stewardship Network's YouTube page shortly, and we will be sending that out. And then I also would like to encourage everyone to attend the remainder of this section, which will be every Monday in February at 1 p.m. And so we hope to see you there. I know that we did have a couple of treatment questions, and so I did want to remind everyone that our third session on the 15th will be about best management practices for invasive species with Tom Alwyn from Eagle. So until our next session next week, I want to thank everyone again for attending. To feel free, of course, to reach out with any questions about this issue, and I hope to see you all soon. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.